Hey, welcome back. A little change of venue for you
Yeah.
today. Um Figured why not?
Yeah.
Be a good idea. So, where we left off last time, we talked here kind of the breakout of Normandy, the breakout of the what is that called? The Upper Peninsula of France. I don't know exactly what
Well,
it.
Normandy. Really?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that area.
And so we move into now the liberation of the rest of the country of France. Correct?
Really fast, yes.
Very much
really
so.
Fast.
Within what, about a month, if not less.
6 weeks, I think.
Okay, so just over a month, we
So
have-
you had like 6 weeks trying to get out of Normandy, and then 6 weeks for the rest of the country.
yeah.
I mean,
So
but you had Operation Dragoon in the south, and of course,
Right.
then once the Germans started retreating after Falaise, they really didn't make any effort to even slow the Allies down.
I think they've realized that. Well,
It was just
let's
trying
cut
to.
our losses.
It was a rescue mission more than a combat operation.
Right.
It was just get everybody home.
right,
Get them behind some sort of line, and the only line available is the Rhine River.
right.
And that, as we talked about with Market Garden, proves to
Mhm.
be at least a temporary halting point. And then winter. Now, winters can be rough, and the winter of 44 or 45 is actually one of the colder ones on record
Yeah,
for that time frame. Almost as cold as 41, 42, which was the first winter that the
right,
Germans were in the Soviet Union.
right, and we're practically freezing to death.
But winters in Europe, being from the Midwest, their winters in Europe seem very, very wet.
I could see that.
Lots of rain, lots of snow.
Right.
Not as cold necessarily with the negative 20s and things like that we get. But,
Sure.
But still, a whole lot more moisture coming down on them than I would probably like.
They're not. They're not. Yeah, they're not the continental climate that we are in the Midwest,
Yeah.
where we just have practically dismal, terrible conditions.
We
But
just look bleak.
yeah, yeah.
We don't get the postcard Christmas, do we?
Right. So now we are into 1944, late 1944. What's going on the Eastern Front at this time?
Well, nothing good if you're a German. Oh, it's just been constant ever since the Battle of Kursk that we talked about.
Yeah.
It's been really can't really say two steps backward, one step forward. It's really just been walking backwards. And the real big damage to the German army. I don't know how long the war could have gone on if it would have been played out differently.
Sure.
But in 41, 42, when the winter hit and those reinforcements came from Siberia and really threatened to destroy the German lines. Because the weather's so cold that your crankcase oil's frozen.
Yeah.
If you leave it out too long when you go pee, well,
You're
done.
probably, Yep. Uh-huh.
That's Hitler issues this no step backwards order, which people say is dumb, but it really is the thing that solidifies the German army and keeps it from just disintegrating in the face of this winter that they are utterly unprepared for.
Well, I can only imagine how these soldiers are feeling after seeing, well, one day their buddy's sitting there, the next day he's frozen solid.
Yeah, exactly. You're when you went to bed there were 3 of you, now there are 2 because the guy on the outside froze because the wind was too strong. It's terrifying to think about, really, that the
Right.
weather was that bad and you had so little equipment
Yeah,
that you're stuffing the when people send you mail, it goes in your boots
right.
to keep your feet warm.
Makes sense.
But anyway, it works really well. So, of course, Hitler being Hitler, that means in 43, as they start to retreat, no step backward.
Okay.
So it already costs the 6th Army around Stalingrad.
Right.
And then it costs the, I think it was the 17th Army in Crimea as the line continues to move west. If you're a German reading the newspaper, if they're putting in locations and you have a map, you can see that this is going the wrong way.
Yeah. We're moving towards the west, not towards the east.
It's
and
like, I think I might want to go visit my brother and say, I don't know, Bonn,
Yeah.
Munich,
Right.
somewhere that the Russians are going to reach, hopefully.
Right.
And then Army Group Center, which in the first invasion was the monster Army Group, but Army groups are temporary. You add and subtract. But Army Group Center eventually basically gets encircled by a blitzkrieg. That's how the Russians are fighting.
Really?
They're slower at it. They're not as good, but as the war goes on, they get better and better at it.
Well, just like any other.
And of course, the Germans get weaker and weaker at defending
Sure,
it.
sure.
And the Germans find, just like the enemies that they fought, when you're trying to defend in a whole front, it's almost impossible to stop a pincer from going in.
Makes sense.
Your only hope is to let it come in a little ways and then contain it, or pinch it off at the base.
Right.
Which is all are very difficult to do under fire while you're being crushed or bombed. And at this point, the Luftwaffe is.
Are they even in
If
existence
you assume
anymore?
that the beginning of the war was a long sword, it's a paring knife at this point. It has just been beaten to a nub.
Well, then
It's
the
been
amount of
constant combat. The number of combat hours you see some of these like Adolf Galan and some of their aces. The number of combat hours is just absolutely ludicrous when you compare it to all the other Allies' top pilots.
right.
I mean, it's like, oh, I only flew 1,500 combat missions. 1,500 combat missions.
That's
what the
a
heck?
huge number compared to what the American. I'm sorry, minus the Tuskegee Airmen, when that's an episode for a whole nother session. But
Yes.
the idea, of course, that most of your American pilots were flying maybe 30 missions before they kind of took a little R&R or
Well, even the fighter pilots who didn't have the whole 25, then 30, then 35, then 50 mission thing, where you got to go home.
right.
But they were usually flying 1 or 2 a day, but not every day.
No,
They might fly 30 in a month.
sure.
So in a year of war, 300 some combat missions.
Not your 1,500 like what your
where
Germans
you're talking
are.
about 5 years. But then, if you started in 1939
That's true. You're kind of average.
and you fought through the Battle of Britain,
And you fought
through all of Barbarossa,
yeah.
and you just haven't had a chance to stop. And
Right.
of course, as we saw and we'll see when we talk about the Pacific Theater, that initial cadre of trained pilots from pre-war era is gone.
Right.
Just general attrition of flying the planes at this time, much better than World War One by far.
Sure.
World War One, you would have never flown a prime minister anywhere.
No, of course not.
That
Of course
would have been
not,
too
no.
dangerous.
Right.
You can do that now. You just run out of guys that are good, so now you're just bringing up these brand newbies. And in any combat, infantry, airborne, whatever, newbies take the most casualties.
Well, they're just not trained, and they don't understand the ins and outs of how
Right.
to survive in a situation where you are literally facing death.
Well, yeah, you could be dead before you know it because you didn't know you did anything wrong. Cause
Right.
You're a newbie. You don't know.
Right. Exactly.
And so when we talked about that,
Yeah, we
Band
did.
of, how Band of
Right,
Brothers
right.
really captured that. We don't talk to the new guys as much because it's too painful.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
psychologically, it definitely
so-
takes a toll.
The war in the East is bleak for the Germans.
Yes.
It's just this grinding push with these. I mean, there's the pincer movements and things, but the line just keeps moving west, and it's a huge line. I mean, until you get to East Prussia, which the Germans are not going to be happy about.
No, of course not.
Europe's really wide.
Right, you're going all the way
It narrows
to
down.
what the border from Finland
Finland
down
to the Black Sea.
Right, that's what 1,600 plus
Something like
miles.
that. It's ridiculously long, and as you move, once you shrink it,
Sure, it
they're in
gets a
East
little
Prussia,
better, but
East Prussia down to the Carpathians, because by that time they're already in Romania
right.
and Bulgaria.
But even by shrinking that line down, you're concentrating all those soldiers into one area, and that's going to make it worse for the Germans on the Eastern Front.
Well, I mean, it makes it better short term because you have more guys in a smaller area, so it's easier to defend.
Right, but
then once the Soviets adjust, now they have more guys in a smaller area. Well, and your situation has gotten worse again. So, like I said, Luftwaffe's gone. The Germans have this reserve, always kept a reserve. OKW, Oberkommando Wehrmacht, the guys in charge of the whole army, always kept a reserve of divisions. Sometimes as low as 10 or 12. Most of the time, 25 to 30 divisions. Solid. Well, not necessarily solid. Most of them are on rest and recuperation leave. They're getting new equipment. They're in training. But they're available if you need them for an emergency.
yes,
Somebody drives a hole suddenly through the Eastern Front. Off you go.
boom.
And you seal it up, and then you take another 30 or whatever. You gather some troops to have a reserve, because having a reserve is the difference between victory and defeat in so many even in little combats, company level combats, a commander who keeps a squad or two back to use at that important point makes all the difference.
Well, and you're also just keeping, again, the not only are you keeping that safety valve, you're also just keeping up the morale, because you're saying, okay, we're not going to be completely defeated. Now, you can't really say that about the guys who are on the front lines who are actually dying and, being wounded, but at the same time, we're not going to, and high command, you're saying, okay, we're not going to be defeated here.
And I think by the winter of 44, I think the message, though, that those troops were bringing home probably wasn't as positive.
No, probably not.
It starts looking probably pretty grim as far as, and I know for sure if I were a German that came back and my family lived in East Prussia, I'd be telling them, you need to go visit Annie Mae somewhere in the West.
Yeah.
And do it now. Don't wait till later. You got to move because the Russians are coming and there's no way we can stop them. We've been trying to stop them since 42.
And they just keep on rolling.
Yeah, every once in a while we push, but it doesn't stay. And so Hitler throws the dice. He's waiting for a winter offensive, which, of course, the Allies don't expect.
You don't usually do such things.
No, the Germans, I don't know that they've launched any winter offensive the entire war.
Right.
Unless maybe in Africa, which doesn't really count.
Well, you're right. Yeah.
It's hot and slightly less hot.
Yes.
Instead of winter.
Yeah, that's kind of your two settings, hot or mild.
Really warm.
Yes. So we now are reaching this winter of 1944. The East is just destroyed. Well, okay,
I mean,
in the process,
they have a
destroyed.
solid line. They're fighting, but it's just they have to keep going backwards.
Right.
And there's nowhere in the East that you can throw these 30 divisions or 40 divisions and make a difference.
Yeah.
There's no way you can slice up to Finland and cut off an army group and really change the course of the war. So Hitler looks west. He's got two things going for him in the West. One, the American army, despite its successes, is not very good man for man, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
The Germans don't have a lot of respect, especially when the Americans don't have their buddies, air power and artillery.
Well, again, we are not a professional army in a way.
No, we're a citizen army.
Right.
Probably 95% of the guys in that army are just looking to go home.
Right.
That's where they want to be.
And they've been fighting for so long they probably are in the point of, hey, let's hurry this up so we can go back home. We said we would be home by Christmas.
They win. They're winning.
Right.
I mean, it's fairly obvious to anybody with a map and any understanding of life. The war's over.
Sure.
It's just a matter for Germany to realize it.
They won't, though.
Well, no, because the guy at the top is not.
Well, he's
playing
delusional.
with a full deck at this point.
No, he's very delusional.
He is very, very upset with his people.
But it also doesn't help that he's, taking quite a bit of
out of drugs.
Yep.
And, freaking cocaine eye drops. And,
Yay!
Craziness.
Yes, gotta love that.
But so Hitler comes up with this idea of a winter offensive. Why? More cloud cover, no air power.
Very good point.
So that nullifies the Americans' biggest advantage.
Yes.
Because, I mean, it's not just the fact that the airplanes can fly over and bomb everything and shoot up your columns, which is obviously a nice advantage.
Right.
But they can see you.
Yes.
There's not a surprise because by the time you get to that division who's defending its position, they know you're coming.
Right.
And they're ready to receive the fight. Makes everything harder. Especially since the Germans have learned with fighting the Russian, short, quick counterattacks are the best way to defeat an offensive. You don't just dig in your heels. You go look for places to punch them. Right. Which is, it's true. It holds true. If you give up the offensive to someone else, the initiative to someone else, you're going to lose eventually.
Definitely.
Because they're the one picking the battles. Let's see. Poland, France. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I mean, literally, when the Germans had the initiative, they were deciding where the war was fought. They won every time because they got to pick the battle.
Exactly. Except for, when they get into Stalingrad and then...
But they got to pick the battle, but it was they picked
They picked one of the worst places to actually have that battle.
Yeah, they literally picked. I don't even know how to compare it. They literally picked an apple when their army was designed for oranges.
Yes.
It's just literally an army designed to avoid the fighting of the First World War, to be mobile and fast and destructive, and then throw it into a meat grinder where equipment and tactics just don't matter as much.
Right.
Where just sheer number of bodies has its own win. But
when we get into now this idea of now taking it to the forests of eastern Belgium.
yeah, we have the
eastern France.
two forests.
Right.
The Hurtgen up farther north.
And then the Ardennes.
The Ardennes, which Hitler loves the Ardennes.
Of
That's
course
where
he
he
does.
came through France first time.
For sure.
So, not being afraid to be a one-trick pony, he goes right back to it.
Yeah.
But his intelligence is really good. Despite all the people they turned in England that we talked about, despite the fact he has no air force that's really functional, they know exactly where the British and American armies come together.
And that's the key.
He aims at that corner on the American side because he knows the British are just fighting tooth and nail. The Americans are more likely to break and run.
Right.
Which, depending on which veterans you talk to, isn't necessarily a horrible thing because you live to fight another day.
That's a good point.
And in an American army, where when you run away, they're going to have a new tank and a new rifle and new equipment for you when you get there.
True.
So, losing a bunch of equipment is not a great loss.
You do what you got to do to survive.
Keeping the fighters would be more important. But
Right.
I don't think that really runs through your mind when a Tiger tank's bearing down on your position and you run away.
Right.
I think running seems like a great plan.
For sure.
You've got a bazooka that literally can't hurt it. You can beat on it with the bazooka.
Yay!
Might do more damage.
But again, now the stage is set.
Yes, the Germans are coming. They've got this. They do an amazing job of moving these armored units in by night. Some of the early, hindsight being 2020.
Sure.
You can see some of those scouting and intelligence reports from like the 4th Infantry, the 28th Infantry, that report large numbers of engine noises and things like that from enemy lines. But there's nothing put together. It's the middle of winter. The Germans have never done it before.
Right. We weren't thinking anything different.
Well, and the 4th, the 28th, several of the other divisions were there to rest.
Right.
They were taking... The Ardennes was a quiet area.
So they thought.
Well, it was until, December 16th?
Yeah, true. When it all starts to...
it's just... there's... Hindsight, again, just looks like, oh, that was a really dumb plan. But in the moment, you've got to shuffle these divisions off the front. They've got to have a chance to relate. As a division or as a unit gets closer to 100 days of combat, your number of guys you're going to lose to combat fatigue, as the term is for World War II. I would very much resist the idea of PTSD versus combat fatigue. I don't think they're really horribly related. I think it's exhaustion. It's mental exhaustion. You're always on the lookout for getting killed.
Right.
You're constantly afraid. Your adrenaline gland can only do so much. Honestly, it's constantly leaking. At least every time there's a branch breaks across the way,
right,
or you hear a mortar fire, even if it's a mile away, you tense.
Exactly.
It just wears out your psyche, and you got to get people off the line, or they'll eventually start to break, or they'll become psychotic. Visit, aka the German and the Russian army. Honestly, when you look at their behaviors at the end of the war, it's terrifying, really.
Yeah, I can imagine so.
If you think about it as a guy going into the army now, it seems animalistic. But when you think about it as a guy who's been fighting nonstop for 4 years, how much of your forebrain is really functioning at this point?
It's probably gone by now. Your body has literally just shut it down.
Well, if you have a problem, you kill it.
Right.
I mean, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you don't
it.
think, oh, that prisoner is starting to struggle. Bang.
No.
We're not going to play that game. We're done.
No.
I don't have time for you.
Right.
Because I need to move on to my next meal, my next shelter.
Whatever the case
I'm going to live.
You are literally becoming to your bare understanding of life.
So, but the American dispositions weren't wrong. They just they were what they were.
Yeah, right.
But then the clouds roll in, and here come some Germans, and it's a monster push. Their goal is to split the army and head for Antwerp, the port
Up in Belgium.
Which is just starting to get open.
Yes.
So this is going to be that forward supply base that we've been waiting for since D-Day.
Right.
Because all the ports are either messed up or hurt by
Well,
damage,
sure.
whatever. And so finally things are starting to look up as far as the supply situation. So he's going to aim there. One, he wants to capture supplies. By the way, if you're running a war and your goal is to capture enemy supplies because you need them, you're losing.
Yes. That's I think that'd be a telltale sign of, oh my gosh, we're on the opposite side. And not just the opposite side of the war, just the opposite side of how things are going.
Yes, we are wrong at this point because yep, I understand the strategy, but at that point you have to sit there in your brain and go, I can't provide my troops food and fuel, so I have to go take theirs. That means I'm losing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the basis of a war, right?
Yeah, you want to be the one that's got all the stuff you need,
and you want others to go and take your stuff.
Try to take your stuff.
Yeah, try to take your stuff, exactly.
But these divisions, one again, worn out,
right,
tired,
right,
not very well equipped for winter.
Sure.
This is the first winter since the landing. Our army, I've watched I don't know how many documentaries, read so many books.
Yes.
Nobody really talks about it, but this is just as piss poor planning as the Germans going into the Russian 41.
Exactly.
There is no plan for wintering.
Exactly. You're right. We don't have winter combat boots. We don't have winter clothes.
They have their regular field jackets, which
Right.
is not enough. Trust me.
You're talking what, like maybe a one layer cotton jacket, or maybe not cotton.
Well,
but
the field jacket is it's warm. It'll keep you fairly warm, probably down to 20 degrees if you're doing something. But if you're hiding in a foxhole, nothing.
You're not
works.
going to see anything.
It's hard to
working.
stay warm if you can't move, and you can't.
Right,
You're
because
dug in. Well, you can before this,
yes,
but after this, when you're stuck in a foxhole because artillery's pounding on you, or if you get up, somebody shoots you.
yes, that's a problem.
That's the end of that.
And so by the end of 44, what, as you said, mid-December of 44.
It was like December, like 16th, I think. I want to say the date is when they roll up that early morning.
Right.
And the 28th Division is basically shattered.
Well, they are well
overrun,
behind,
shattered,
right.
Whatever you want to call it. And again, they're not on leave, but
they
a
are
lot of
on.
their officers are.
Yes.
They're back in Paris or they're in London. They're there to rest and relax.
And so you are having to now rely on NCOs and
Junior officers.
Someone who, especially your junior officers, probably not as much combat experience.
Well, the cadet class of 44 is here.
Yes.
They've made it, but they have no experience.
Sure.
Their experience so far with the Army is West Point and a boat.
Right. True. You're right. And so when they see these tanks rolling in, you can't imagine what is going on, what is going through their heads. They have to be realizing, oh my gosh, we're in the thick of it now.
Oh,
and
yeah. And honestly, even the troops that fought through Normandy, like the 4th,
mm-hmm.
they had never seen a combined arms German offensive.
Right.
They were fighting through the Bocage, which was the Germans mainly on the defensive. Machine guns, tank destroyers, anti-tank guns, even tanks, but they weren't used in the same way.
They were used
Here,
as almost a...
It's in mass coming at you.
Right.
This is really the first time the American Army has been attacked by the Germans since the Kasserine Pass.
Oh my gosh.
In Africa.
And that's what, 2 years?
2 years.
A year and a half, 2 years ago?
Couple divisions ago.
Yeah, for sure. And even on a different continent. But the idea is now we see all of these tanks rolling in. And we see your German infantry coming through. And, well, of course, the name says it's all. It's a Bulge.
Yep. And it's not because the general was fat.
No. No, of course not. But the Battle of the Bulge was
There's just a bulge in the line. It creates a bulge in the line. Instead of this line goes down the Rhine, suddenly there's this big, 50 by 20 mile, 20 miles deep, 50 miles tall, bulge in the lines. And in that bulge was supposed to be the arrow that pushes out. But that never happens.
Well, and the best, and I guess what I could say is the best thing is that they didn't get to Bastogne. The Germans did not.
Got to Bastogne. They got all the way around Bastogne and farther. But but the problem is you can't supply an army without roads.
Right.
And Bastogne is 7 roads come together in Bastogne.
Right.
So the 101st Airborne runs in there, no equipment, no winter equipment, very low on ammunition, and they're told to hold this crossroads along with it was an armored cavalry group, tanks, which are never mentioned in any of the movies.
Of course not. Why would they?
I'm thinking they probably had something to do with the victory.
I would assume so. I mean, well, we talk later on with the 3rd Armored.
Yeah.
Right. They kind of help.
It was, touring Bastogne and seeing like some of the views. It was, in a good position for defense, but without some sort of armor, I don't know that
you would have lasted.
I don't know that the 101st would be anything but paste.
Yes,
because you just run tanks over the top of them 2 or 3 times, and there's not much left.
Right.
I mean, that's no disrespect to the 101st. We can't. I mean, we already talked about how the Airborne was just head and shoulders above the rest of the divisions on the Allied side, and even really on any side.
Right.
Because of their training, their esprit, their courage, whatever. Because you have to have courage, whatever you want to call it, to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Maybe it's not perfectly good, but you still jumped out.
Yeah, right, exactly. You did it willingly, or most of the time.
Well, or for that extra paycheck, whatever. Right. But, the line gets pushed back, but there's this hole in the middle of this bulge where Bastogne is, and the German offensive reaches. I can't remember the name of the river. Meuse. The River Meuse. The goal was, of course, just to pound across that and then head to Antwerp, because there really wasn't any American or British troops back there. So once you got there,
it was a free shot.
It was a free shot to Antwerp. But because they couldn't get supplies to their front lines, because some busybodies were in their way.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, even the 101st, though, the division commander's out.
Right.
He's off somewhere consulting with their next airborne drop. So you have the assistant division commander McAuliffe is in charge, and it's just, it's a mess.
Right.
But they hold.
You're right.
For 7 or 8 days, which doesn't seem like long, but if you're being shelled 24/7.
It's taking its toll on you.
And you have nowhere to go.
Right. You're literally in your foxhole just waiting to make sure that doesn't hit your foxhole.
If you get hit, you go into town to the aid station where you're still getting shelled.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It's just...
It's a terrible situation for many of these soldiers, but the end result, as you can imagine, the end result is that we start to see reinforcements. We see now coming up from the southern portion is the 3rd Armored Division.
3rd Army.
Right, you're right. I'm sorry.
I do believe the 3rd Armored Division was with them, yes.
Correct, but the 3rd Army, Patton's 3rd Army coming up from the south, and they help to reinforce and push back many of these soldiers.
Which is, especially Patton's maneuver. He's, by the way, on an unofficial invasion of Germany at the time.
Right.
Because Eisenhower didn't think they had enough supplies,
so he just kept rolling through.
So, he had to stop because of lack of fuel, but he'd gathered up enough fuel so he could launch his own offensive to get across the Rhine.
Right.
And then the Bulge happens.
Yes.
He takes his entire army, which is many divisions.
Correct.
I don't know how many at this time, but definitely more than a dozen.
Right.
He literally wheels them 90 degrees to face north and goes into the attack.
Right.
Something that's never been done. It's a a testimony to, all we hear about Patton is go, 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 fire, go, right.
Right.
But that takes a whole lot of training of your staff. The people who make these kind of things happen, the ones that set up the transportation schedules, that this armored unit goes through this town at this time, because you only got one road. You can't have three divisions trying to get through one town.
It's a bottleneck, and you have to make sure that everything's strategically placed in every time.
To take an entire army and take that spearhead from the fight you already started,
yes,
out of the fight, and then up, and then have the rest of the army run around behind them.
It had to have taken a lot of gusto. It had to take a lot of mathematical.
Oh, it had to take a lot of
strategic planning.
And you think about that citizen army.
Mm-hmm.
You think of these staff officers. I mean, these are the accountants and the insurance actuarial guys that are sitting in offices before and after the war.
This man,
they got the cool little visors.
Yes, exactly.
And the adding machine. But that they're so well trained, so well oiled, which is a tribute to Patton's teaching, really, more than anything else.
Correct.
Is that they knew when they could cut corners. It's like, this is what we know we have to do, but if we really can shave off some time, we can stop these two things.
Right.
And make it happen faster. And it does. I mean, they wheel and turn in, 48 hours?
Yeah.
And they're striking the southern end of the Bulge. And then the British start striking the northern end of the Bulge.
And eventually it dissolves for the Germans.
By the end of the year. I mean, 14 days later, basically.
Correct.
They're being pushed back. I think the Bulge finally the last chunk of the Bulge falls in January, but because it's over.
Because by the beginning of January, you do see the skies starting to clear up. You see more of your aerial assaults.
It's before Christmas even. You start having air power again, which that's the end of the line.
Correct.
Your supply lines are fair game to a bunch of P-47 and P-51 pilots who just can't wait to unload their guns.
Oh my gosh. And you also have to realize that a lot of those then resupply shipments come through as well.
Oh, yeah.
Which is huge for those soldiers who have been bogged down for the last, 14 days, not having adequate materials, not having ammunition, because you're going from place to place just trying to find who's got some spare ammo, who's got who's got this, who's got that. You're literally just bare bones in that forest, and so now we start to see more of that resupply, and that again helps to push those Germans back behind, at least further,
basically up
eastward.
To the West Wall again.
Correct.
The Siegfried Line or the West Wall, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And that's the next assault in the spring. But the Bulge, end result of the Bulge is probably took a couple years off the life of Eisenhower from stress.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Definitely put a lot of fear really into the American people.
Sure.
They see in the papers the Germans are starting an offensive. They pushed, divisions. Lots of a division's lost, and the 101st is surrounded.
Right.
And these are your heroes.
Right.
They heroes of Normandy, heroes of Market Garden.
Right.
And suddenly they're effectively lost because nobody can get to them.
Correct.
But then
luckily
they become bigger heroes.
Right.
Battered bastards of Bastogne.
What an alliteration there.
Oh, whoever wrote that one gets the
gold star.
Pulitzer for the year.
Yes, exactly.
Automatic.
Yeah. So again, that brings us to now the final drive to Berlin.
Yeah, I mean the Bulge. Really, what the Bulge does is take that strategic reserve and throw it away. Mm-hmm. The net gain is nothing.
Right.
For the Germans, I mean, scaring your enemies for a couple weeks doesn't really count as a big win.
No.
You've lost a bunch of armor that you didn't have to lose.
Correct.
And now your ability to change events is gone. You are now at the mercy of both the armies around you. They get to decide when the attacks happen, where they happen.
Right.
And
just a final little note here on the east side. You're still seeing all those Russians continuing to pound the eastern front and pushing it further and further into places again.
And they're into Poland at this point.
Yes, they've
definitely crossed the frontier.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well-
Germany basically doesn't have anything but Norway and Denmark,
Right.
and that they've taken from other people. Well, Yugoslavia, but
That's getting ready to be destroyed soon.
so next time we'll look at really the military end of the war.
Right.
There's some other things we need to talk about as we get there, but
That's more diplomatic.
well, there's a couple discoveries we make that we're gonna talk about, but the Battle of the Bulge is Germany's last shot,
Correct.
and it fails utterly.
They shot craps, unfortunately.
Yeah, they didn't roll a 2, but it was close. They had to match a hard 3.
Yeah.
Not
sorry
that there
about
isn't
it.
anything but a hard 3, but
Right. Right.
So,
Well, hey, again, come back next time.